Hello, and welcome to the Geopolitics Explained podcast. In last episode, we discussed the history of the UAE, before then exploring the situation in Yemen and how the Saudis and the Emiratis clashed in December 2025 and into January 2026. This has seen relations between the two nations take a clear hit, and the next development in this declining relationship has been the recent news that the UAE has decided to leave OPEC. Today, we'll discuss why the UAE decided to make this decision, before then looking forward to the future. How will this shift affect relations between the two nations? Will they repair their relations from here? Or is this another stage in rising tensions between the two Middle Eastern powers? It's these questions that we'll attempt to answer today. The UAE officially announced its withdrawal from both OPEC and OPEC Plus, with this change taking place on the 1st of May. The UAE was a member for almost 6 decades, and this is the world's 7th largest oil producer. With these characteristics, what are the most important changes that we will see from this move? Firstly, this change will allow the UAE to pursue an independent strategy when it comes to crude oil. In an effort to balance revenues for oil producers, OPEC uses production quotas. In a world that is experiencing restricted trade and declining globalization, the UAE has stated that the world will demand more energy and that they are positioned to meet this need. Outside of OPEC, the UAE can pursue this shift without restriction. Another important change that this will drive is the weakening of OPEC. OPEC was initially formed in 1960 with Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela, the original 5 members. The main aim of the group was to defend the interests of the major oil exporters by coordinating production. With the UAE being the 4th biggest oil producer in OPEC, their departure will see OPEC lose 15% of its production capacity. This is a hit to OPEC's ability to control global oil prices. Another takeaway from the UAE leaving OPEC is that the quiet geopolitical tensions between Saudi Arabia and the UAE clearly remain. With the UAE departing, they now have an incentive and the ability to increase production outside of a period when its facilities aren't being hit by Iran. This will weaken Saudi Arabia as de facto leader of OPEC, and this is a hit that the Saudis will feel. But this also highlights the regional geopolitical issues, as both nations are in the pursuit of capital and greater influence in the region. Another development from the UAE leaving OPEC that's clear is the domino effect coming out of the Iran war. The UAE was constrained by OPEC quotas on production. With them departing the group, they now have complete control, as I stated earlier. I question if we could see other nations seek a more independent strategy outside of OPEC limitations. In the past, Iraq, Kazakhstan, and Russia have frequently faced pressure to compensate for previous periods where they have overproduced in regard to OPEC production quotas. Could they be nations that will consider departing OPEC, as energy supply chains have been hugely disrupted by the blockades from the conflict between Iran and the United States? The group, in their next meeting, will likely agree to a small oil output quota hike, but in an effort to fairly balance oil revenues, crude output remains restricted for many members of OPEC. In March, OPEC Plus averaged 35.06 million barrels per day, and this was down 7.7 million barrels per day from February. Also, there is a precedent here. Back in 2020, we saw Russia and the Saudis clash as Russia refused to agree to a 1.5 million barrel per day cut proposed by the Saudis. In response, the Saudis cut prices and increased their own production. This led to crude prices falling, with WTI famously trading negatively. With Russian production also limited by Ukrainian drone strikes, could Russia once again seek greater control of its production? A final development from the UAE departing OPEC is the win for the United States. Trump has previously called out OPEC at the 2018 UN General Assembly. He stated that the organisation, quote, rips off the rest of the world by inflating oil prices. Trump also stated that the US offers military support for the Middle Eastern states, while they exploit this support by imposing high oil prices. The UAE departing weakens OPEC, as we discussed above, which in general is a win for the United States, as another vital actor when it comes to the energy sphere, especially in crude oil and liquefied natural gas. So the UAE's departure is clear, but another question I want to address is what will happen to relations between Saudi Arabia and the UAE as we move forward. Is this the end of this chapter that has seen relations decline, or are relations set to decline further? Before diving into relations between the UAE and Saudi Arabia, I want to discuss the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia, because this is relevant. One key area of interest in the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia is crude oil. It's been suspected that Trump has asked Saudi Arabia and OPEC to lower crude oil prices before. The most recent occurrence of this was in January 2025, when Trump demanded lower prices to reduce Russian state revenues in an effort to end the Ukraine war. Around this time, we also saw Saudi Arabia pledge $600 billion in investment in the United States over the next 4 years. It's suspected that the United States said that if the Saudis didn't pursue lower crude oil prices, the United States would pull back US defense commitments in the Middle East. The United States' military role in the Middle East is also an interesting point here. In the past, when the Saudis and the Iranians were clashing, the US supported Saudi Arabia both physically and as a lurking military force in the background should any situation escalate too far. This came before the Chinese brokered peace between the Saudis and the Iranians, which had seen diplomatic relations restarted and embassies reopened. However, the Saudis are the clear goal for the Americans and Trump when it comes to the Abraham Accords and normalising relations with Israel. Despite the United States' military support for Saudi Arabia, there is no greater military support than that which the United States offers Israel. Also, through the signing of the Abraham Accords in 2020, the UAE holds a unique relationship with the United States through Israel. This is seeing two emerging geopolitical axes in the Middle East, and it highlights how important Saudi Arabia is in the region. Israel, the UAE, and India sit on one side, with Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Turkey sitting on the other. The Israelis and the Turks constantly take shots at each other. India and Pakistan remain in a tense conflict in which we saw sparks and Kashmir fly last year. And this entire discussion over the last 2 episodes highlights the rising tensions between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. We've also recently seen the UAE request that Pakistan repay a $3.5 billion loan. This saw the Saudis lend Pakistan the money to repay the UAE. The Israelis, the Emiratis, and the Indians are also pursuing the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor. And the Saudis and Pakistan have pursued the Strategic Mutual Defence Agreement. Once again, this highlights the rise of modern-day conflict across multiple domains. The end goal for both of these groups will be greater regional influence and control across a range of realms, including financial, technology, and defence. But the key question that remains here is the Saudis and their potential inclusion in the Abraham Accords. This would dramatically reduce the power of this current narrative that the Middle East is seeing 2 coalitions form. Now, the Saudis have stated that their inclusion in the Abraham Accords is conditional on the creation of a Palestinian state. Without this, tensions could continue to spark between these coalitions, and the United States could lose the opportunity to pursue a more cohesive environment in the Middle East. Also, the UAE departing OPEC is a huge shift, is a huge story for crude oil demand and fossil fuels generally. I'm of the belief that nations need a diversified energy portfolio to protect themselves and to build resiliency. Developing strategies such as wind, solar, tidal, and geothermal are vital, especially if they are suitable for the environment in which they operate. But for now, energy portfolios around the world will continue to include fossil fuels such as crude oil. Fossil fuels accounted for 74.8% of total energy consumption in 2024, according to the IEA. We can't ditch this overnight when it's vital in our everyday lives for transportation, electricity, industry, agriculture, and heating, for example. Also, nations are at different stages regarding their energy portfolio. A nation without clean cooking fuels or electricity for its citizens will pursue the cheapest, most readily available energy source, regardless of any second-order effects such as pollution or environmental damage. Until cleaner methods are incentivized financially, lower-income nations will pursue any strategy to improve the quality of life. And so, the UAE leaving OPEC is a huge shift because fossil fuels will remain hugely relevant for many more decades. It's also a huge shift because it could be another step in the decline in relations between the UAE and Saudi Arabia. But this decline isn't yet set. The status of the Abraham Accords and Saudi Arabia potentially joining could be one of the biggest developments that we see in the Middle East if it does occur. And so as we look forward, as relations decline between the UAE and Saudi Arabia, the Saudis potentially joining the Abraham Accords would be one of the biggest developments to keep an eye out for. The Iran conflict remains centre stage in the Middle East, and so many of these forces unfolding in the background remain under-discussed. But some of these trends have the potential to be just as influential in the future direction of these nations and in the Middle East region collectively. That's all for today. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on the podcast platform of your choice. I've been Dylan, and I'll talk to you next time.